Hello, everybody. Welcome to using web services for editing linear reference data. I see a lot of familiar faces here. Some folks that have already stopped by over our linear referencing booth. If you haven't been there yet, we're right behind this wall, kind of in the back right of the Oasis area here. Feel free to stop by with questions. I hope you'll have a lot of questions after this, as we're just going to kind of do an introduction of the configuration and publishing process, and then show a sneak peek at the new API. So for those of you who haven't met me yet here at the conference or previous conferences at user conferences, my name is Matt Zebarth. I'm a product engineer on the location referencing team. We make and maintain roads and highways, as well as pipeline referencing, our domain-specific linear referencing solutions at Esri. I've been at Esri for about 6 years, doing enterprise geodatabase work and linear referencing, of course. My colleague, Devlin Das, is sitting here up front. He's one of the developers on our linear referencing team. Feel free to ask either of us any follow-up questions after the show or through tomorrow. Please come over to our booth. We'd be happy to show you a demonstration, go a little deeper if your organization would like to see that. So to give you an idea of where our solutions are right now, as our landscape is changing a bit, ArcGIS pipeline referencing for the utility space is already out, fully functional. And we have two paradigms for that product. We have one which is our traditional version product, which we initially released a few years ago. And then we have our new paradigm, which uses our new API, which I'm going to talk about today, which uses branch versioning and feature services. For our roads and highways product, we already have that out in ArcMap. It's been out now for about 5 years, 5+ years. And we're bringing that into ArcGIS Pro to use the feature service architecture this year. So it should be by the end of the year, we'll have a first release for that, so that both of our linear referencing solutions will be using the new API that I'm going to show today. That would be with 2.3 and 10.7 for pipeline referencing, so that's going to be out in just a few weeks. Everything that I show in regards to the API documentation is going to update in just a few weeks when 10.7 Enterprise is released. So please, I encourage you to open up the link again and see some of the updates, as we do have a lot of new changes there. So the new API, here's the link right here, which I'd like you to update in a few weeks. It supports our Esri feature services architecture. You may have already heard about this before, which is using the branch versioning paradigm. And ArcGIS Pro is publishing, consuming, and then editing feature services from your ArcGIS server, which is federated with ArcGIS Portal. So the days of editing linear reference data directly through an SD connection or a file-based approach, this is replacing that, essentially. And of course, it has a lot of advantages to following that architecture, which I'll show a little bit later. So, but just to be clear, I want everybody to know that we are talking about the new paradigm, which uses feature services, as we did have an old linear referencing API available specifically for editing events, which may be assets or attributes in your organization. So this is just a quick sneak peek of the help documentation. And the reason this is exciting to us is that we've put everything into the API. So previously, the linear referencing API had event editing, and it had conflict prevention. And that's what ran our event editor web application that came with roads and highways for server. So the new API has conflict prevention, of course, a new implementation of it. It also has geoprocessing, network editing, event editing, centerline cartographic editing, and of course, we still have the event editing from we had the previous API. So this is just a quick sneak peek at what it looks like to acquire a lock or to apply edits. We're going to go through these. I just like to include this in the slides in case later you don't have access to the demo presentation and you want to get some reference off of these slides. Just a quick show of hands in here. Who's already using or building on roads and highways or pipeline referencing? Okay, so not too many yet. Hopefully that changes in the next couple weeks when 10.7 comes out. So I want to start with a walkthrough here on how to configure this. As some of you might be thinking, okay, I have access to pipeline referencing for server, or I want to be an early adopter for roads and highways when it comes out later this year. What do I do? How do I get this set up? How do I get a linear referencing capable feature service so that I can start exploring this API? And this is probably a new process for most of you who haven't used feature services in Pro yet. It might also be a new process for configuring your LRS in ArcGIS Pro. So I'm going to show the configuration and publication process. I'm going to just go over the slides here so you have it for later reference, and then we're going to dive into Pro and the endpoint. So to start out here, what we have is you have a geodatabase connection at ArcGIS Pro, similar to what you had in ArcMap. You want to make sure that you change your connection type to branch type, which is the new Esri versioning paradigm. Once you do that, you can register your LRS feature classes as branch version. Of course, you can also register all of your other ancillary feature classes as branch version as well, if you'd like to add them to your editing service. When I say your LRS feature classes, what I mean in our information model would be your underlying centerline geometry, your route network, your calibration points, your event layers, and then any intersections, or if you're going to do any as-built or red lines, you would add that to your map, make sure it's registered as branch versioned, and then we can enable time on those layers. And the reason we do that now is location referencing, which is roads and highways, as well as pipeline referencing, uses a temporal model. So we maintain your edits to your networks and your events throughout time in your event and network feature classes. We don't rely on geodatabase archiving or anything like that. Everything is there for you to run segmentation and analysis in the actual feature classes where you're storing those assets. So you want to enable time before you publish to ensure that your LRS layers have time enabled in the feature service and the map service. So I do have a branch versioning joke, but I don't know if I want to say it unless we have some folks who have experience with branch versioning. Is anybody here already, okay, we already have one enthusiastic hand up. Is anybody here using or familiar with branch versioning so far? Okay, so we have a few, so I can probably get away with it. So a quick description, a branch version is a version that is created, edited, and maintained through the REST endpoint. Whereas previously, a traditional version, you would create and maintain that directly through a geodatabase connection, and you would communicate with the database directly from ArcMap or ArcGIS Pro, or maybe your web app to handle versioning capabilities, right? So here it goes. So why is a traditional version always seeking attention, right? Because it's a restless child, right? Isn't that fantastic? I will be at the linear referencing booth behind this wall for another day and a half, and I do have more jokes. So they're not going to be as good as that one, but I had a few months to prepare. So, all right, let's keep going here. So the next thing we want to do is we want to share, right? So in ArcMap, what you used to do is you would share as a map service directly to your server that you connected to. In ArcMap, you would authenticate it directly to your server. So it's a little different now. So in Portal, what we're doing is we're using a geoprocessing tool, essentially. It's kind of a wizard format geoprocessing tool with different panes. And what we want to do is publish a web layer. We want to turn on feature access, of course, since we're going to be editing. We want to add the linear referencing capability and the version management capability. And that's because when you use a linear reference feature service, we're using the, I will call it the core version management service instead of recreating that, right? You don't have to use the linear referencing specific versioning. You're using the VMS, as we call it. And then we're going to analyze that. Of course, you want to make sure that you've registered your data store with your server, and then we'll publish that to your portal. So from there, we'll go to Catalog, and this is how we're going to consume this in Pro. We'll go to the Portal tab in Catalog. We'll right-click your feature service with the red icon on the little yellow map, and we're going to add that feature service to the map of your choice. Now, you can always drill down into that feature service if you'd like, and just add a few layers that you want to edit. But our users will typically add the LRS minimum schema items to their map to begin editing, or into their other web applications, such as Event Editor. So once you're in ArcGIS Pro, your editing is actually going to take place through the feature service that's consumed from Portal. And you can tell you're doing this right if you have the little blue icon there. The first thing you're going to want to do, of course, is change your version. You don't want to do default. You don't want to edit the default version through the feature service because you won't be able to undo or redo your changes there. If you want to take advantage of the undo-redo stack, you need to create a child version. And then as soon as you add a feature service that contains any LRS layer, which is registered with the LRS network, your location referencing ribbon will appear for editing and conflict prevention tools. So let's show some of this stuff that I've given a crash course on. All right. quick switch. Oops. Should have just. So what we're going to do here is we have a situation where concurrent editors in the same organization are editing a route, and the route is already created in our LRS network, but another user wants to extend that route. They want to do an LRS edit activity in the web directly through the REST endpoint. We have conflict prevention enabled here, which is controlled through the LRS endpoint, and that should essentially control access to this route. So we have here in Pro the route network, and this is our location referencing toolbar here. This is the route in question. Excuse me. This is the route in question that we're going to make an edit from the endpoint. As we can see here, the route is not currently locked. So what we want to do is we want to create a lock on that route. So before I do that, I actually want to go back and just really quick show some of those paradigms that I had mentioned. So when we're publishing here, you'll add the layers initially from your geodatabase, and you want to make sure at your geodatabase connection properties that it's set to branch. That's a key requirement to start out, right? And then you make sure that your actual layers are branched. And if I show you, let me show you the network here. If I show you the properties of this, we can look at the source and we can see that this is versioning type branch. And then we can also look at our location referencing properties, and we can see that, yes, this actually is our engineering network for our linear referencing service, and we can see the spatial reference properties as well as any of the other field configurations for our network, right? So we're ready to go to the next step at that point. Then we would go through the sharing process. And once this tool opens up, we would enable feature access, and we would add our capabilities. Now, a few things are key here that I don't think I mentioned previously is that we added the data as the data owner, and we're added as the default version. When you publish a feature service with branch versioning, you need to publish it as the data owner and the default version, which is then propagated up to the server. Everybody else will then manage their access and identity through Portal. Okay, so here's where you'll add the feature access, and of course you'll add the linear referencing and version management capability. So if you're working directly from the endpoint, and you see that the map service endpoint doesn't have these capabilities, you'll know that you'll need to republish. And this is a common occurrence. First time we start using this is it's a new paradigm. So if I go back to my other map, which is already published, we'll now see that this is coming from a feature service, which is using a version or user ArcGIS with version EPC dev, right? And I added that by going into the catalog pane, going to Portal, and then getting content directly from my portal that this user called ArcGIS, who signed into Pro, either created or has access to. It was shared with them. So now, if I want to identify this route from the endpoint, I can see that because conflict prevention goes through the endpoint. It's a feature service capability. This route is locked by this user, ArcGIS, in this version that I'm showing you right now, EPC dev. So what I want to do is I want to extend this route onto this white line here, which happens to be a centerline geometry. I want to increase the length of demo route from 0 to 6, and I want the geometry to follow this white line, right? I want to extend the route, as we call it. I shouldn't be able to do that initially because I need to acquire a lock that's already owned by a different user. So let's go ahead and see what happens. So the first step would be to acquire the lock. Now, of course, ArcGIS Pro will handle all this for you if you're editing in Pro. But if you're doing your own application, if you're extending this API, you'll need to acquire the lock yourself. You might want to query the locks. You might want to delete locks yourself. We have all those endpoints for you. And I'll scroll through the API doc after the demonstration. So as you can see here, I'm logged in as a different user, demo user versus ArcGIS. And I'm also trying to acquire a lock here as a different version, EPC Dev 2. The acquire locks input here, we're passing the line ID, and that's because in pipeline referencing we have a concept of lines and routes, where a collection of routes, a line is composed of a collection of routes. So in this case, in order to maintain data integrity of all of the routes and events that are participate in that line, we need to lock the entire line, right? So we're going to lock the line, and then the layer ID here is layer ID 3. That corresponds with the feature service layer ID. So I'm going to go ahead and try to run this. Sign in again. Come on. Okay. Okay. So as we'd expect, we couldn't get the lock, right? So here's our response. So to explain what's happening here, this line ID from this network is already locked by a different user called ArcGIS in a different version called EPC dev. And if this was an event feature class lock, we would also get the name of the event which is locked, right? And this, of course, will tell us in epoch time when that lock was acquired. So there's a few things we could do here, right? Depending on if there were edits in that version, we might need that user to reconcile and post those edits or to delete their version, right? Because we can't, if they're already partially through the linear referencing process, they still need to propagate those changes to their event, we can't just simply drop the lock. That wouldn't be safe. However, if they acquired that lock but they haven't yet made any edits, they can just simply release that lock. That's perfectly fine. And if we tried to perform this edit directly through our apply edits endpoint and without acquiring a lock, we're also going to get an error message, right? You need to have a lock in order to pass an edit. It's built into the LRS paradigm. So we don't have that yet. So let's fix that. So it turns out in this case that this user hasn't done any edits in this session, right? So all they need to do is simply release their lock. So let's go ahead and select this feature just using our normal selection tool. We're going to select this route. We go back to our location referencing pane, and we can see that the release locks button is now active. So let's go ahead and release the lock. And then when we identify that route, we're going to see that there is no locking information up at the top. This route should be available, and if there were more routes in this line, they would also be available, and any events that are located on this route would also be available to then edit directly through the endpoint. So let's go back into the endpoint here, and let's try to acquire that lock again. Okay, so now we have a lock and our return is success, and it also just lets us know which line we have currently locked. And this is actually stored in the locks table, which is a non-version table, which you can always access and query if you needed to. Our query locks endpoint essentially hits that for you. So now that we have our lock, we can apply our edit through the REST endpoint. So to explain what's happening here, we're trying to extend a route and network with layer ID 3, an effective date. This translates to March 7th or tomorrow. This is the centerline object ID that we're extending onto, which is the white line north of the route ID, of course. And then 4 and 6 is what we would like the extended section to have the measures of. So the beginning of the extension portion, which is the upstream portion of the extended area, we want to be measure 4, which happened to be the previous end of the route. And then we would like it to terminate at 6. The downstream portion of the route will now be 6. And then, of course, extended end, we're just letting it know to be true. We could also extend at the beginning if we chose to. And we're going to push that edit through this version, demo user.epcdev2, which is the user that we're using through the REST endpoint only, not in Pro. Okay, so success is true. We now have the object ID of the route that we extended and the route ID just in case we needed to pass that into the next step. Needed to run a geoprocessing tool or a post or something like that through the VMS. So now that that step is done, to prove that I'm actually doing edits across the ArcGIS platform here, not just things in the web and things in Pro disparately, what I can do is I can change to that version, since it's a public version, EPC Dev 2, and I can show you the change in Pro. I also could have done the same thing if there was a change in a web app or something like that. All right. Where is my change? Page 6. Refresh. What's that? No. Shouldn't. Yeah, I did. And this is where we would see the purple line be extended with the measures of 4 to 6. I'm not quite sure why it hasn't updated. I might have had Pro open too long. I'm not quite sure. So I can open that back up in a minute, and we can see if that was the problem. No, not yet. I'm going to see if it will appear. We still have time. So the concept here is that each organization is going to have a different set of edits that you might choose to do in ArcGIS Pro versus what you might do through an endpoint, maybe your own app that you build, or through our event editor application. And what I'm referring to is there's a workflow to complete the LRS editing process, right? So first you'll perform a route edit, and then you will run a geoprocessing tool to update your derived network. Let's say if you have if you're using pipeline referencing, you have a continuous network that you're not directly editing. Then you will run maybe another geoprocessing tool to push your derived event measures onto the other derived network. So for instance, if you have all of your events located on your engineering network that you're editing, but you still want to store those event measures on your derived network, we have a geoprocessing tool that will translate and then propagate those to your event feature classes. And then of course we need to actually run the apply event behaviors tool, which will update all of your events based on your new route changes. And you might have other geoprocessing tools or ETL processes that your organization will use. And then of course we have the locking. The locking can be controlled in ArcGIS Pro or in our web app, or you can handle that yourself. Okay. And I am not sure where the edit went. I'll try one more time here. It should have already posted. BC Dev 2. Yeah, that's already done. Okay. So if anybody has any more questions on that part, I can go a lot deeper over at the linear referencing booth, and I'll of course figure out why that route didn't extend there. So to go back, okay. Okay. So a quick recap here. So ArcGIS Pro, in this new paradigm, it publishes, consumes, and then edits the LRS feature service from ArcGIS Enterprise. Portal then handles the identity and the sharing, which would be the sharing of the feature service, as well as roles, privileges, and access that would have previously been file-based or administered directly in the database. Version editing is handled through the VMS, which is a service. And then if you wanted to configure your linear referencing service from scratch, you can follow this link. We have a tutorial that guides you through our set of geoprocessing tools. You'll be able to either load your own data that you already have, or you can start from scratch and create linear referencing container, linear referencing networks, events, calibration points. It'll all be there and guide you through our geoprocessing tools. So what's coming next for our API as well as our extension, because there's so much overlap now. Esri Roads and Highways and ArcGIS Pro, which will be utilizing the API I just showed, is coming later this year for the first release. ArcGIS Pipeline Referencing, we're integrating that with the utility network. Those folks are here. I encourage you to talk to them if you have interest or if you work with a vertical integrated utility. The utility network already takes advantage of branch versioning and feature services, right? So we're following along with that same paradigm. You'll be able to publish a feature service that has both capabilities so that your transmission and distribution, as well as your gathering units will be able to work together inside the same geodatabase. You'll be able to reduce a lot of your editing duplication. And then of course, this API allows us to add undo redo capabilities to our web app event editor if your organization utilizes that. So I have business cards up here if you want to talk to me later on after the show. Otherwise, please come by the booth. We're here through tomorrow. The expo is not open Friday, just to give you a heads up. And please give a survey if you have the app. Thank you. If anybody has any questions, we still have 5 minutes. Yes, go ahead. Yeah, that should work.
The locking. If somebody locked it, who's able to unlock it again?
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Unlocking and locking. So if somebody locked a version, who will be able to unlock it again?
Okay, so there's two different locking paradigms. So if you're just if you're locking a route. Okay. So there's two locking paradigms, right? If you're locking a route, you can control that through the linear referencing service. If you're the user that owns the version, that owns the route lock or the line lock, that user can release it. The caveat there would be if there's a live edit, if there's an edit session, or that user has edited that route, they need to post and reconcile and post those changes before we'll allow that lock to be releasable. If they just simply created the lock for some analysis or some viewing purposes, that's fine. That user can then release that lock. Now, if branch versioning also has a versioning lock paradigm for read locks and write locks. And that actually follows the same rules. If you are the owner of that version, you can essentially close your pro session or your web app session, and it'll release that lock on that version. The read and write lock versioning, you probably won't run into that in a normal workflow because we wouldn't recommend that different users would share access to the same version. We would prefer that a user would have an identity that would then own a version. So.
You created it as a branch, so then would you need to reconcile before it went back to the parent? So how would you kind of handle, I guess this is a good example because it's such an easy thing to do in Pro, but the whole point of going through this whole process is so that end users, maybe like 20 or 50 of them, can all do this at the same time. So when you have all these branches coming in, would it be one person doing the QA, QC and reconciling, or would it be the end user? What is that process?
Sure. This is specific to the branch versioning, not the route locking. Is that what you're saying? Or both?
Well,
I can answer either question.
the end of that.
Okay.
At the end,
Sure.
you have all these branches, right?
So branch versioning has a flattened structure compared to traditional versioning. There's only one parent for all branch versions, which is default, and then every child version is a child of default. There's no 2, 3, 4 layers of QA, QC anymore. So when the user is done with their linear referencing edits, they will reconcile and post with default, and that will release all locks. However, if you wanted to selectively release an area, let's say because another user or another unit has some follow-up work to do, then you can transfer actually the ownership of the version to them. That's a capability through the feature service. Or you can release the lock one at a time directly through either the console or through the endpoint so that that next unit can then take over that route. So you have a few options.
Do you think it didn't post to
What was the question, sorry?
Do you think that's why it didn't work? Is that it didn't reconcile?
I shouldn't have had to because I switched to the version in ArcGIS Pro, and there shouldn't have been an open session because we just committed a single edit in the endpoint, and that should have been it. That should have been the end of the session.
It's probably a caching issue.
It was very likely a caching issue, unfortunately. That didn't appear for 5 hours of practice.
I guess it kind of seems like there's no control. Like if that should have just happened, overseeing it,
No, so the route locking paradigm succeeded. We essentially transferred the lock by dropping it in Pro and then reacquiring it by another user through the endpoint. And then the edit went through. The issue of why it didn't show up in Pro was likely a caching issue. Yeah.
That probably is not related to conflict prevention
Right.
or route locking. It's just a ArcGIS Pro caching issue maybe.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you, everybody.